recording. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Malinda Trujillo. Dr. Trujillo is joining us as also a member of the National VA Psychology Training Council Multicultural Diversity Committee, and she also serves on the VA Race-Based Stress Trauma Consultation Team, and she completed her postdoctoral internship at the Greater Los Angeles VA Ambulatory Care Center. So really one of our pleasures to have you here, Dr. Trujillo. I'm going to hand it over to you so you could introduce yourself a little bit better, since I don't want to just read off to people what was already included in the announcement. Really excited to have you here and look forward to learning from you.
My name is Dr. Malinda Trujillo, and I'm a psychologist here at the Portland VA Medical Center, and y'all have seen some of my bio. I think it's important to create a safe and brave place when I am presenting on DEI, and so I just want to talk a little bit about my positionality. I am Latinx and white. I am bilingual. I'm Spanish speaking and English speaking. I am cisgendered, and I serve as a staff psychologist here at the Portland VA. And some of my areas of interest include diversity, equity, inclusion, multicultural counseling, race-based trauma, and trauma in general. In addition to serving as a clinician here at the Portland VA, I also provide education and training in the community on these areas. And I hope that we can create a safe and brave place in terms of when we have the discussion around this topic, because I know it can be hard to share about this topic in terms of how it impacts ourselves, whether you are on the receiving end of unconscious bias or have unintentionally engaged in unconscious bias. So thank you all very much. So the learning objectives today are to enhance our understanding and awareness regarding unconscious bias and how it impacts the recruitment and retention of diverse psychology staff and trainees, to provide skills for recognizing and combating unconscious bias at the personal, professional, and organizational level, and provide skills for creating and fostering inclusive and equitable psychology training and work environments. I'm going to do a little bit of a review. I'm guessing that most folks participating today are going to know these definitions, but some folks may not. So unconscious bias or implicit bias are the attitudes, stereotypes, or beliefs that impact our understanding and decisions in an unconscious manner. These biases are both positive or negative and are activated involuntarily without an individual's awareness or intentional control. Whereas explicit bias are the attitudes, stereotypes, or beliefs that we're consciously aware of having. I want to talk a little bit about characteristics of unconscious bias. Unconscious bias are pervasive. What I like to say is it's an equal opportunity bias. I mean, not bias, virus. A lot of times when I give these presentations, it's much easier to talk about how you might see other folks engaging in bias, but it's harder to see ourselves in that lens. I also think that comes from one of our consciously held or unconsciously held beliefs as helping professionals, that we don't, because we're trained the way we are, that we may not engage in bias, but I think we all do. So I want to normalize that. And they can be consciously contrary to our explicitly held beliefs and values. In fact, many of our unconscious biases directly go against what we consciously believe. For example, I've taken some of the unconscious bias tests from Project Implicit from Harvard. And I was raised in a multi-ethnic neighborhood, but I took one of the tests around my beliefs about men of color and violence. And I actually showed up that I had a slight negative bias towards men of color engaging in violence towards European Americans, which surprises me, given my background and my own family system. We tend to hold unconscious biases that are in favor of our own in-groups. The dangerous part is the unconscious part. So that's what I think why unconscious bias is so important, is because it impacts everyone at the micro and the macro and systemic level. The good thing, we're all in the brain sciences, is that unconscious biases are malleable. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is what are some practical tools we can use to combat unconscious bias. So the reality is that unconscious bias is often explicit and shows up in discrimination, racism, homophobia, sexism, etc. One thing I might encourage you all to do, when I first got trained to be an unconscious bias trainer, the idea of it wasn't new to me, but when I came back, I started just looking at the environments that surrounded me. So this was about 10 years ago. I know I came around and I looked at my own VA system and I realized that we had I kind of already knew this, very few psychologists of color. Most of us were able-bodied. Most of us looked relatively fit. Most of us, had certain, looks to them. And I never really looked at, just taking a look around at our system, just kind of looking about that today. And it's not like there's anything wrong with having hiring folks that are majority culture, because that's kind of what psychology looks like. But it made me start to question the way things are set up. For example, I served on a trauma team, and when I had just come back from an unconscious bias training, I noticed that all the women sat on the periphery and the 3 men in our team sat at the front, even those who were not in leadership positions. And so I started sitting at the front. There's just little ways that it might show up if you start to just kind of pay attention. And what it does, if we're not aware of it, is it may hinder our ability to assess and evaluate equitably, and it impacts our decisions and perceptions and positionality. What I also want to talk about is microaggressions and how they overlap. So microaggressions are common daily indignities and demeaning messages that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights towards diverse groups or individuals. They can be intentional or unintentional. So you might have conscious awareness of them. They are often communicated by well-intentioned people who are unaware of how their messages may impact the recipient and the systems to which they're a part of. They're often invisible to the perpetrator and the recipient. I believe in being a facilitator participant, so I'll give you all a brief example. I am Latinx and I'm white passing. And when I was a student on applying for graduate school, many of the schools I applied to would directly address my Latinx background and the way I physically presented in some of the interviews, which I wasn't surprised at, but at the same level, given our background and training, it did make me at times feel vulnerable. And so I'm sure all of us could share experiences where part of our intersectionality was brought up in a way that perhaps was well-intentioned, perhaps wasn't intentional, but impacted the way we perceived ourselves and the places we might have been interviewing or serving as a provider or trainee. So what I want to talk about is how these concepts interconnect. So there was a very famous article written years ago by Peggy McIntosh called The Little White Knapsack, where she just talked about her white privilege, which this is way back in the 80s. And she just talked about how being white, she could, walk into a grocery store and find, hair coloring and bandages in her color. She could walk into a store and not be followed. And she went on and on about how her white privileges followed her throughout the world. And she talked about like wearing a little backpack of privilege. So I like to take that idea and say, we have our backpack of our background, our race, our gender, our ethnicity, our sexual orientation, where we went to school, what part of the country we're from. Maybe we're an immigrant, to so many parts of our intersectionality. And a lot of times, depending on what program you trained in, we're trained to think that we check that at the door. I don't think we do. In fact, I think we carry it everywhere with us. And if we're not aware of that, we can impact folks in both positive and negative ways. So what happens is our background, our socialization creates unconscious bias, which in turn leads to microaggressions and biased behaviors. So what this can do is lead to advantages and disadvantages, which ultimately set up disparities and exclusion or equity and inclusion. So that's why I said, one thing you can do is just take a look around who is represented in your programs and your trainees. And if you see that there's disparities, why might that be? Could it be that we're not actively recruiting diverse students? Could it be that we have negative or positive biases in one direction or another? So I really like to talk about how they intersect. Another example that I can say from graduate school is when I went to graduate school, we had no programming, no supports, no mentoring for students of color. And that we, right from the get-go, were treated differently. I know when we got in, a couple of us were actually asked if we were sort of like diversity picks. Many of us had statements made towards us about our ethnic background or other non-majority culture backgrounds, whereas my white peers did not experience that. And I will say, I hope we've changed in the 15 years since I've been in graduate school, but I've heard many stories over the years from other BIPOC and underrepresented both staff and students that still sometimes their experience more often than not. So I want to talk about some examples, and many of you may have heard of these. So how does this play out in our own field? This is an old study, but in a large national study of academic psychologists, men were given more favorable ratings and hired more than women. African Americans with similar credentials were less likely to receive grant funding than whites. Equally accomplished CVs with white sounding names were 50% more likely to get callbacks. This is a very classic unconscious bias study, and this has been repeated across country, across discipline and vocation repetitively. Also, in a recent study of BIPOC and LGBTQ plus psychology students applying to clinical psychology Ph.D. programs, it was shown that LGBTQ plus students were more likely to be advised not to discuss their personal information, like their sexual orientation, than cisgendered heterosexual students. I would say I know personally what I was going through this process, both as a staff and a postdoc and an intern, that was some of either the direct or indirect advice that I was given. And so these findings don't surprise me. And I just want us to look at the numbers. As of 2018, most psychologists are white, 84% of psychologists are white, and 26% are psychologists of color. Under 36, with compared to 8% over 50. So we're getting a little bit of movement in mid-career to ECP psychologists, but there's a huge gap. Only 17% of psychology faculty are racial or ethnic minorities, which is lower than the percentage in the physical sciences, computer for information sciences, and education. And women make up 56% of psychology staff, which is good. And it compares favorably to some other vocations, but is less than others. For example, in education, 68% of faculty are female. And this is just a look at the numbers where you can see that psychology is in purple. And for example, education is here in teal. And so we are doing better than some fields, but not as well as other fields. So what I want to talk about is different kinds of biases. So when I've taken unconscious bias trainings, we often talk about negative bias or bias against. And what research shows again and again and again is that we tend to devalue, overlook, and pathologize and minimize the values, experiences, and accomplishments of those who are different from us. And our bias against minorities and other culturally diverse groups tends to follow societal norms and trends and can be counter to our consciously held beliefs and biases. We also tend to have bias in favor or affinity bias towards people who are like us. We tend to esteem, promote, connect, and give attention to people like us. We call it chemistry, we call it connection, we call it a good fit. But what it does is affinity bias discourages diverse and inclusive workplaces. So a couple examples in psychology might be some of what we call selection criteria. For example, I've seen rating systems. Well, what school do they go to? Is their school have a better reputation than another school? That's an affinity bias. That's a belief about certain kinds of training that places one folks an advantage over other folks. Another thing, in psychology is access to higher education. There's a huge disparity for students of color. And so sometimes maybe they didn't have equal opportunities to go to the big name schools. And so that's one idea of where affinity bias may play out. Also, we like to talk about our gut reactions, of getting a good feel. We might do interviews and where students look fairly favorable, but we just get our gut reactions and we go with it. I know I've sat in selection panels where that's what we've done. And we say things like they'll fit into our culture. But I have the question is, what is our culture? Is it a diverse, equitable culture, or is it a culture that either consciously or unconsciously mirrors society, which tends to favor white folks, which tends to favor folks of higher SES and not favor people from an underrepresented or diverse background? Another place that these biases can come out is in the interviewing process. We might, provide more questions, lean in more, connect more with folks that we see like us, and we attend less to people that we perceive as other. Also, workplace opportunities, and this comes up in resumes. We tend to promote, esteem, provide resources and opportunities to folks who are like us. Maybe they're from our school that we trained in. Maybe they're from our training program. And that was also in VA psychology. I know we like to take our students because we provide good training, but are we limiting our sample sizes when we're not really doing active recruitment outside of folks who trained within the VA system? I know that's one thing we did here at the Portland VA. When I was hired about 15 years ago, predominantly most of the psychologists on our staff were former postdocs or interns, but we intentionally started to recruit outside of not just our VA system, but outside of the VA system. And what it did is it started to actually change the makeup of not just our psychology department, but also our mental health department. So I might ask you to think about what are ways in the ways that we recruit that we might be intentionally or unintentionally having bias in favor or against culturally diverse groups. So here are some ways to challenge affinity and negative bias. Interrogate your own opinions and thoughts. One of the unconscious bias trainers that I admire said, when you're certainly certain that you're certain, question your certainty, actively seek diversity. So where are you advertising? Are you advertising in, outside of traditional listservs? Are you networking? How are you advertising? How are you seeking diversity? How are you connecting? Consider your similarities and your differences. So when you're evaluating a candidate or someone for an opportunity, don't just think about how they may fit, think about how they're different. And you might see those differences an asset rather than a deficit. Find common ground with everyone. There's this concept called micro affirmations, where if treating everyone with kindness, respect, centering them, having good communication skills, what research shows is that when we have negative affinity bias or someone's not like us, we tend not to attend as much to them. And so you might just think of those little micro counseling skills that we all learned in graduate school and applying them very intentionally to staff and trainees and applicants that are different from you. A big thing to also do is question your intuition and certainty. What I like to say is we need to shine a light on ourselves and one another, especially in the hiring and recruitment of students and other staff. So here's some questions you can ask yourself. Does this applicant remind me of myself or someone I know? Are these elements of the CV, such as the format or the style, that positively or negatively influence my overall impression? What elements of this CV am I considering that are not relevant to the job or the position? Are they connected to the predetermined competencies in the rubric, or is it more about your own gut feelings or your own preferences? Am I evaluating the skills and experiences actually listed on the CV, or am I making interpretation and assumptions based on the candidate's skills and experience? What are ways I've already excluded or endorsed this candidate and why? So it's taken a 360 lens and looking at why you are asking the questions you're asking. Why are you attending more to the applicants you're attending more? Is there anything you're missing? If you have a positive bias, can you look at it in a different way? If you have a negative bias, is there another way of looking at it? So it's being evidence-based in the way we evaluate staff and students rather than going with our gut. What I also want to talk about is institutional biases. I just want to read you this quote because it sticks out to me as well. Organizations are not neutral. Overwhelming evidence shows how organizational processes and structures are, among other things, gendered, classed, and racialized, which has consistently been linked to the way in which human beings are biased in their evaluation of each other. And like I said, just look at the numbers. 84% of psychologists are still from European American or majority culture backgrounds. And when you just do a hard look around your VA system, around your networking, around your students, around who you pay attention to, who's at the table? And not only are they at the table, are they being centered? Also, the institutions and organizations that we work for, they tend to promote institutional norms and procedures that foster a culture of belonging and advantage to the dominant social groups in the workforce, while fostering a disparate and devalued impact for those who may be underrepresented in the workforce. A prime example of this, and not to say that all students of color are going to come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, but the disparities that we see in education, we also see in housing and SES. And we know that in terms of like Latinx, African American, Native American, and other BIPOC folks tend to have a higher tendency to be from a lower SES background. That's not always true. And so a lot of the way we provide funding, expectations for interview, I know some of that has shifted since COVID. We've become more open to like online interviewing, but I remember when I was applying for internship and postdoc, the expectations that we were to fly to all the sites in person if we really wanted to get a slot. Or even in hiring, beginning or mid-career staff, like are we making decisions that are equitable in terms of the hiring process? So that's one way to think about it, access. And then once we have hired a diverse staff or student, are they coming into a culture that values them? Do they see other people like them? Are you finding ways to connect to them? And what I would say, and this is my bias, is when I look at the VA system in general, is that I think it tends to favor European American cultural values, and we tend to center the way we conduct both our education and vocation around those values, which is not uncommon, but that's one thing to start to look at is how is your organization set up? Who is getting the opportunities? Who is getting mentored? Who is being promoted? Who is being centered? And you need to start to think about that. So what are some ways of addressing institutional bias? You might ask yourself, why do we see this applicant this way? Could our norms or assumptions be factors? Are we not promoting someone? Are we not selecting them because of our cultural norms? I know a big example in some of the VAs I've worked at is there's sort of this bias about favoring Ph.D.s over PsyDs, favoring clinical psychology over counseling psychology, favoring big name schools over maybe state schools. Also, with our affinity bias, we tend to like mini-me's. I know that we don't call it nepotism, we call it networking, but sometimes our affinity bias may keep us from actually seeing the value of someone who is different from ourselves. And sometimes the way our institutions are set up is they reflect that at a macro level. Do we have information we need to make this conclusion? So like when we're on the selection panels, going around and saying, how can we view this differently? Why are we excluding them? Why are we including them? Is this based on our gut reaction, or is this based on the actual evidence we have based on, their actual skills and abilities? Have we considered all perspectives? I really like this one. When we're thinking about including or excluding someone, especially a BIPOC person or someone from another underrepresented group, look for ways to say yes. And that's why I said, take the 360 lens. Any of you who've done CBT work, be a lawyer against your own thoughts. Don't overlook or undervalue the unfamiliar, the unexpected. Maybe this thing that we're considering a deficit, if looked at through another lens, might be a benefit. compare candidates to criteria rather than to other candidates, because when we start to compare candidates, and we do this, I know in selection committees will say, well, this person has more publications and this person came from a better school and this person, but that actually shows in research to just affirm our biases. So compare them to their own criteria, compare them to their own experience. More experience doesn't always mean most experience. I know one thing that I have a personal critique of is when we often look at how many hours of clinical training that we have as a rubric. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have good training, we shouldn't have a lot of clinical hours, but I know sometimes that rules people out. Maybe they, for example, I know a lot of times it rules out some of our veteran candidates that are applying to our psychology program, because a lot of them may be serving in the military at the same time. They may have a job, they may have to support, you know, their family. And so another thing to look at is what are our inclusion and exclusionary criteria? And by having these just as they are we excluding diverse candidates that might actually add to our learning and professional experience and organization? You know, there's that old movie from the 90s, Field of Dreams. What I like to say is if you build it, they will come. Like for some folks, I'm going to say some of the bias we have here out in Portland. Portland is like statistically a fairly European American white area. So for a long time, we were assuming here that, you know, we're mostly going to get students who kind of, you know, fit, you know, the cultural milieu that is in the greater Portland area. We also had that bias about clients as well. But when we started to actually create different experiences and starting to try to change our cultural norms, then we started to see a shift in the kinds of staff and students we were recruiting and maintaining. We still have like growth areas, but when we made our unconscious bias conscious, then we were actually able to start to make changes. I know one of the things we did is we started to actively recruit outside the VA system, and that not only did we get more diverse applicants and staff and students, but we also started to expand representation at our VA. We still have a long way to go, but it was really important. Recognize that your own institutional bias may influence how you define merit and excellence. So like I said, a lot of the rubrics that we see as just norms or questions that we have, I think actually tend to exclude minority and BIPOC candidates. Consider culture adds, which are the various forms of diversity that add value to your team and department. You know, what can they bring? What do we not have? How are they bringing to the table? For example, if you hire more BIPOC staff and you're able to maintain them, you might also open up doorways for BIPOC students. And you might also start to challenge the disparities that are for our veterans of color. Because what I want to say is a lot of these disparities we see in our training programs, we see them with our clients as well. And I think unconscious bias and microaggressions are a lot of the reasons that we don't see as many minority veterans in the VA system, because our system both explicitly and implicitly reflect white cultural values, which may, for some folks, make them not want to train or even receive services at the VA. I also think the VA is working really hard to change that, but I think it still plays out. So now what I want to do is just talk about some practical skills for mitigating unconscious bias. Big thing is highlight your commitment to diversity. And don't make it window dressing. That's what one of my colleagues says. So it's great to talk about diversity and equity inclusion in your recruitment materials or in your job postings, but if you don't actually follow up with that behaviorally, it can actually cause more of a problem. Because if someone comes into your system with the expectation that you're going to be living the values you express, and that doesn't happen, that just adds to microaggressions, both and bias and negative experiences. So you've got to follow it up with behaviors. Verbiage is good, but behaviors are better. Before you make assumptions or evaluations about applicants, colleagues, or trainees, remember the power of bias. Consider your gut reactions as possible indicators of unconscious bias. In fact, that's why I said, if you're certainly certain that you're certain, there's probably some kind of bias going on. Encourage perspective taking. Take that 360 lens. Acknowledge your power and privilege. So some of you may have seen my introduction in, the flyer for the training. So one thing I do is I acknowledge my intersecting identities with applicants, with students. I do that when I provide trainings. I get comfortable with providing more information about places I might feel vulnerable. And a lot of us have been trained not to do that. And a lot of us sometimes will think, well, if something's going to be important to a student of color or an applicant, they're going to bring it up. But we have to think about power differential. If you're already a staff psychologist, if you're already licensed, if you're already in a position of power, that may make folks from an underrepresented group not feel like they will be able to speak up about their needs. And so instead of assuming that it will be brought up, make it part of the interview process. Make it part of what, after you hire, to check in, to ask about mentorship. Always err on the side of discussion. Asking yourselves, are cultural difference, values, worldviews coming up in this room? Try to consider situations and interactions from the colleagues or training or candidates' perspective. Put yourself in their shoes. How would you feel? How would you perceive this? And I know someone asked, will these slides be available? Yes, we can. I believe that they will be available via PDF version. So what's another way to minimize unconscious bias during recruitment and hiring? Write inclusive job descriptions. You might try to use gender neutral language. Again and again, research studies have shown if we use masculine language in job and training descriptions, we might unintentionally exclude BIPOC folks or women or non-binary or transgender folks. And so how are your job descriptions written? Another thing that is recommended is blind reviewing resumes. Given those studies again and again that when folks have, I don't like to use this word, but ethnic sounding names, we're more likely to have negative bias. You might remove names of people and institutions and gender pronouns to see, do you view this applicant differently? Write down your first impressions and then question whether these impressions are related to your biases. Evaluate each candidate based on their own merit and suitability to the job rather than comparing them to others. When considering if the candidate would be a best fit for your institution, ask yourself, is my institution reflecting majority culture values? White, Western, ageist, gender bias, ableism, attractiveness, etc. And that's not to say that if there's an applicant who, is more majority cultured or able-bodied or from a great school, that they're not equal viable candidates. But a lot of times, if we really start to question our values, they tend to reflect majority culture values, which tend to promote white folks or people from more privileged backgrounds. Diversify your selection panels. Have representatives from diverse sections, gender, profession, type of degree, ethnicity, even outside your team, outside your VA. Like I said, we can tend to promote from within, which there's nothing wrong with that, but also we might be excluding a huge amount of diversity and cultural richness if we tend to have a group of people that are responsible for selecting who predominantly represent the majority culture and are predominantly from our institution. I know, for example, for me, when I've applied for jobs or when I was a student, when I went to a selection panel and there was somebody like me, Latinx, biracial, I grew up lower SES, like that made me feel safer. That made me feel valued. That made me feel wanted. And I also know, especially when I was a young psychologist, when folks presented me with opportunities and mentorship to help connect to other BIPOC folks or other underrepresented folks, it helped me kind of manage the cultural milieu of the VA and other systems that I've been in. You might do a work sample test, broaden your outreach to different listservs, non-traditional listservs, consultation groups and networks. I know we've been doing a lot of that at the VA in general. Already talked about hiring candidates outside of your system. So here's some ways to maintain diverse staff. Promote systemic education at all levels on diversity and multicultural competence. So you gotta talk the talk and walk the walk. It's not an adjunct. It's, you know, like what I like to say is APA says that DEI is not just an add-on. It's just as important as the DSM-5, and so we got to live it. Connect and incorporate diversity into your organizational and team mission. Create networking and mentoring opportunities for BIPOC folks and other underrepresented groups, and make it intentional to explore how biases impact your system at both the micro and macro level. You might foster cooperation over competition, create networks of support for allies and bias targets. A big thing I like to say is, not only do I want a seat at the table, I want to be centered, I want a voice. So one thing we've done here at the Portland VA, we had growth edges when it came to DEI. We centered the voices of students. We centered the voices of BIPOC students with the encouragement, might I say, from our BIPOC and other represented students. So like, who's being centered? Whose voices are being heard? And if you find that they're not being heard, then you need to do something about that. Some ways to do this might be doing, you know, anonymous surveys, focus groups, just bringing it up, leverage your privilege, man. Like, ask. You never know until you ask. Identify shared goals and values. Offer opportunities to seek information and promote cultural shifts. You know, don't just outreach to those with the least amount of privilege. Have them be centered. BIPOC and LGBT plus applicant, like an example of this, research shows that BIPOC and LGBT plus students consider programmatic commitment to diversity more important than most other aspects of training compared to non-Hispanic whites and students and cisgender heterosexual students. So like I said, you can't just walk the walk, you got to talk the talk, you've got to walk the walk. And it can be an adjunct. It's got to be integrated. One thing I'm going to say as a BIPOC provider, it cannot only fall on the shoulders of BIPOC folks or allies or people who do DEI work. So it's not enough to just have a multicultural and diversity committee or to have BIPOC folks represented. Also, if you're asking BIPOC folks, ask if it's in their benefits. Some folks, you know, just because they're BIPOC may not mean they want to do mentoring. They may want to, but like, this can't just be on the shoulders of BIPOC and other underrepresented groups. It has to be everyone. So what I'm going to do before I open it up to questions is I'm going to, what I like to do at the end of DEI is to have an action plan. Like, what do I do about this? So I may encourage y'all to think about these questions as I ask them, or honestly, when we come up to the question and answer period, you might share your answers. So I'm going to read them. What is one thing I can commit to within my professional roles regarding recruitment, hiring, and retention of staff that are related to unconscious bias? I know one thing that I've done is when I've had the ability to give feedback to our DOTs about how we ask questions, what are our rubrics. I've talked about these concepts, you know, in terms of like, what cultural values are we representing in the way we ask questions? Who are we centering? Who are we not centering? Who's on a selection panel? How can I and my colleagues shine a light on one another regarding unconscious bias? How can we hold each other accountable in recruitment, selection, and retention of staff? One thing is to ask, take a 360 lens, use those good counseling skills that we've all learned to question, be a lawyer against your own thoughts. And don't just expect that yet again to follow on the people with the least amount of power or privilege, because sometimes that's what happens. It's a lot of BIPOC folk, a lot of other underrepresented folks speaking up, but that gets tiring. I don't mind doing it and I'll keep doing it, but I need allies. I need folks with more power than me. That's one thing I say is like, hey, if you've got power, man, use it, leverage it in a way that's based on centering and allying and making opportunity. If it ain't there, build it. What can my team and organizational structures that I'm involved in do to explore and challenge unconscious bias in regard to recruitment, hiring, and retention of diverse staff? So these are just some things that you can ask yourself. These are questions you could also take back to your organization and to open up the discussion about how you're confronting and combating bias in recruitment and retention of diverse staff and students. So that is the predominant didactic part of this presentation, so I would like to open it up to any questions. I see that we're being asked to use the Q&A feature. I'm new to Zoom webinars. Does the Q&A feature show up in the chat, or where does it show up? Because the first time I've done it with Zoom.
No worries. I'll actually read them out to you here. That way you don't have to worry about that. So the first question is, are headshot pictures of candidates for training positions helpful or harmful in using to remember the student interview content for faculty, students, or both?
You said headshots of students, correct?
Right. That's right.
I don't know the research on this, but I know some, like, I would actually say, based on the research about just names, right? Like ethnically sounding names, I would actually go with, I mean, it's hard because I know from the practical thing, like we want to remember people, like when you have 100 students come, like it's practical, but I also think it's a good way to actually have both affinity and negative bias, like assumptions we make about people based on the way they look. I'll just use myself as an example. If y'all look at me, most people's stimulus value for me is white, middle class, privilege. That is actually not my cultural experience. So I think it can go in either direction, but I would say if you use them, then you need to be asking these questions. Are we making any affinity biases or negative biases about the student based on how they look phenotypically, like, and, I think that comes up with being able-bodied. We also have like invisible disabilities that people don't see. And so like, I think if you're going to use them, then you really need to bring up bias. Like, is there, what kind of bias it might be playing out? I could get why people might use them from a practical, like there's 100 people we've interviewed, how do you remember? But yeah, I would definitely use some of the tools in this training if you do use them.
All right. And the other question is, let's see here. I'm thrilled to hear that you have recruited from those that have trained outside of VA. Can you talk a little bit about the logistical barriers in terms of how you work with HR around this?
So I, like in terms of like advertising or in terms of the hiring, I will say I am not a manager, so I may not be the best person to answer this question, but I know that one thing we did here at the Portland VA is we advertise not just on, USA Jobs. We intentionally try to recruit, and we also got broader, in terms of our selection panels, and we were like, hey, like, is this person not from here? Like, and if they aren't from here, like, how can they, what would they bring to the table? How would that be different? So I don't know much about the HR piece of it, but
right. And I try to give it a stab there. Typically, your hiring manager gets to make that decision with HR whether they're going to post internally to VA or externally to VA, and there's really no restriction there that says that people that are being hired onto VA must be trained within VA. The qualification standard kind of outline, what education you need, the fact that you have completed a internship. That doesn't necessarily have to be a VA internship. So definitely something to go back to your local leadership and HR to kind of discuss further. So the other question is, let's see, I appreciate any advice from creating hiring and related rubrics, especially we are now trying to incorporate DEI into scholarship type rubric by adding rating metrics to offset the traditional rubric items that are probably affected by more disadvantage discrimination barriers. It feels impossible estimating and measuring disadvantage, but necessary. Any thoughts?
I think a great question. So where I might say some of it is, specifically, like if you have questions that we all have rubrics to make decisions, we all use numbers, but if you have them, then you might actually balance them out with other things. For example, if you focus a lot on training hours, like, is there a way to also give areas of credit or, rating numbers to something else, like coming from a diverse background, coming from a different training background, you know, or also just bringing them up in terms of questions like, hey, this person's lower on hours than our average, but wow, like they're a veteran, or they're a BIPOC student, or they, you know. And so what I would say is I don't have specific advice as to like what's the best way to go about that. But I would say is like try to have balance in terms of your rubric. So if you are gonna highlight some values that are pretty, you know, might be very black and white and exclude people, maybe there's a way of adding other values and other questions that would balance it out. I know here at the Portland VA, we've also talked about like just boldly having those questions, asking them when we're evaluating candidates, like, is there something we're missing? Are we excluding people? And if you're not seeing BIPOC, what could we change different on our rubrics? What would be more representative? I know we've decided to go back to doing, we had done more of like an open house, and now they're doing interviews, but the rubrics they're using in interviews are more balanced, and also with like the rubric you might use in evaluating the application. And so there's a lot more diversity and bandwidth for the way we're rating, which would make it more likely for us to be more inclusive rather than exclusive.
Thank you for that. So this is an interesting question as well. Is there any data to show how performance-based interviewing helps or hinders diversity hiring?
So you mean, so let me question by like performance-based, like where you give them like a case study, or is that what
I would say how VA typically does their interviews, right? So you'll get a set of preset questions that everybody's kind of rated on. Those questions are usually not provided you know, beforehand.
I would say that I don't know this, like what I do know comes from research is those, if you only do those performance-based questions, they tend to reflect the institution that you're from, and they tend to be biased towards white folks. They tend to be biased towards folks trained in the VA. They tend to be exclusionary. And so what I might say is I don't know exact research study to quote, but if I was on a selection committee, I had like the knowledge, skills, and ability questions that come in VA or other like federal jobs, I would start to be like, is this excluding people by asking this question? Is this, do they even know what this is if they've never served in the VA? Like, is there a way of having more inclusive questions? Is there a way of having broader questions that you know would value coming from outside the federal system? But I would guess that if we're not really evaluating those questions, they would promote VA culture, which isn't bad, but does tend to promote from within and does tend to mirror. I mean, we mirror the Department of Defense, which mirrors the military, which is a very white Eurocentric culture. And so I would start these same questions we're asking about candidates, ask about the questions you develop.
Yeah, I think that's so important, Dr. Trujillo, because I think sometimes we include questions that are kind of provide an example to account for DEI, a DEI clinical example, but that in and of itself doesn't mean that we're accounting for the bias within the question. So really great response there. So the other question is, these conversations we may be having in other arenas, so I own my knowledge deficit here. I would love to, for additional resources on white American, Euro-American values that certainly are the norm within the larger organizations of the VA. Yeah,
like within, so I have I don't know about VA specific, but there's there's this idea of white superiority culture, and some people might hear that name and go, but it's really more of, it's not about like the KKK's, you know, in a system. It's more about how have I, yet again, with my backpack, unconsciously or consciously soaked in the affinity bias of promoting white folks, promoting white culture. You know, I'll tell you a couple ways. For example, in DEI presentations, white folks tend to talk first. They tend to center their questions first. They tend to sit up front. I am mixed race, and I'll tell you, like, sometimes I'm overly talkative, or I've asked a lot of questions, and I think that comes from my personality, but also my background, my mixed race background. And so I've started to ask like myself about how do I present? What is my positionality? And so there is an article on white supremacy culture, which really opened my eyes, like things that I just thought were like good communication, how they might be interpreted by BIPOC folks. And there's actually a group called the Dismantling Collective. And they are a group, not just psychology, but of social science activists who want to help white folks learn about white culture, white supremacy culture, and how to be a strong white ally, both in their organizations they serve and in their personal life. So I can definitely send Dr. Villarreal that article on white supremacy culture, and he can share it if I think there's a way to share. And then definitely I would recommend the Dismantling Collective. If you just Google the Dismantling Collective, it's one of the best websites I've seen for how to start to address white identity, white allyship, white supremacy culture.
Great, thank you. And this is maybe related to the question that you answered before, but are there any things coming down either through APA or psychology training for how to rework rubrics to standardize to make sure that it doesn't work against DEI?
This might be a bigger question I could answer. I don't know, do you know Dr. Villarreal? Because I used to serve on some of the I serve on the MDC committee, the Multicultural and Diversity Committee for Psychology. I don't think we've been working on just how to address DEI structurally as a training program, like how to meet APA's requirements and create like a diverse like training organization. But I don't think specifically on rubrics for evaluation and selection. But I don't know if maybe this is happening at a higher level, like at OMHSP. I don't know if you know Dr. Villarreal.
No, not that I'm aware of. I'll go back and take it back to our OMHSP DEI committee and see if there's any work there. But I know that, you know, typically we kind of move away from kind of being so prescriptive in terms of saying everybody must use the selection criteria. So I think that's probably why there's just so much variability and why we're having this conversation. But definitely I'll go back and take that question. I know we're going to be running short on time here, so I'm going to move us on to a couple of other questions here. I know people have used the term blind review, but consider that as a microaggression. What do you think about using the terminology anonymous review?
Yeah, I think anonymous review would be a great way of like flipping that on its head. I don't think, I wouldn't know. I think there could be other words used. I don't have any off the top of my head, but yeah, and that's actually something that is pointed out to me. So thank you, because I think that might have been actually listed in my handout. So thank you for making me aware of some bias that I wasn't aware of. Yeah, I think looking at verbiage is really important. If you can find a way to flip it on its head in a way that is not exclusive, for sure.
Right, right. And then the last question we have is regarding recruiting from outside VA. I've wondered about how having rating items like experience within veterans in VA or assessing applicants based on whether or not they've specifically wanted a VA career could be affecting those selections. Really good question.
I would say we do tend to have those questions, at least not necessarily in the advertisement, but that's very common. I've done on a couple selection, and also for interns, that's part of a lot of applications. I would say yes, that it is important. It's something we can consider, but it is exclusionary. So as you're asking these questions, like how is this excluding folks? That's where you might ask other questions. You might put, if you know that's in your rubric, then you might say non-VA, something around what's their non-VA experience? What are their other training experiences or clinicals? How can this be an asset to our team? How can this be a growth edge? Like, for example, I have seen some recent job postings that have gone up on, some of the listservs that we're all on, talking about specifically looking for BIPOC folks or allies who have actually done DEI work outside the VA to bring that to the VA system. So what I might say is, of course, we're going to probably have that question either in our rubric or in our actual questions of how you work with that and what's your experience, but you might balance it out. Have a question about, their non-VA experiences, their other assets, their other skills, their background. How is that going to be an asset to our VA?
Yeah, I really like that approach. If you're going to ask about this, make sure that we balance it out in some way. Dr. Trujillo, I wanted to again thank you for being here with us today. Obviously, really important topic. A lot of really great, engaging questions. We'll make sure to um, have your presentation along with the referenced resources posted with the recording. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Sines here, who's going to close us out with some announcements about some upcoming webinars that we have in store.
All right. Thank you again for this wonderful presentation. We definitely look forward to seeing you again in March. That being said, just as a reminder, you do not need to email the Education and Training Committee unless you are a registered participant who has joined via telephone versus the Zoom link. So just kind of putting that out there again. If you joined via the Zoom link, we are able to see that you joined via the Zoom link. That being said, we have a wonderful presentation coming up in January, and that is by Dr. Susanna Creech. And this presentation is going to be focusing on addressing the impact of PTSD on family functioning within organized healthcare. And in that presentation, Dr. Creech will be reviewing studies spanning treatment development to large-scale implementation of trauma-informed treatment to address intimate partner violence and parent-child functioning difficulties in veterans. And this presentation will occur on January 6th, which is a Monday, 2023, so in the new year at 12 p.m. Central Time. Please, if you all have any questions about that, let us know. I'm very excited about the presentation as well as I know the division VA section is, but we look forward to seeing you then.
And then one last announcement for our members, just as a reminder that our upcoming quarterly meeting is going to be coming up in the new year on January 19th at our standard time of 3 p.m. Eastern. That invite has already gone out. You should have received an email or an Outlook invite. Please save that on your calendars. We look forward to seeing you all on January 19th, where we're going to be providing some really good updates on what we're going to be looking forward to in FY23 and 24, and as we start also starting the conversations for how we're going to plan for the APA convention and the VA Psychology Leadership Conference. So, Dr. Trujillo, it sounds like you have some last words for us. I'm going to hand it back to you before I close this out.
Possible suggestion, because so there, Division 18 has a listserv for providers of colors and allies, and a lot of these questions y'all ask about how job advertisements, rubric standards. Folks, I love that listserv. I'm part of it. So anytime I have a hard DEI question that I don't have like the best research, I throw it out on those listservs, and you'd be surprised what other VAs are doing. Also, there's a listserv. The VA Psychology Training Council has a diversity listserv as well. So I will make sure to share those. I mean, Dr. Villarreal knows both of those, but when we send out the resources, if I were you and you had questions about rubric and what are people doing, I would throw it up on those listservs, because you're probably going to get some amazing answers and some great resources that I don't have the tip of my fingers, but I know anytime I've had a difficult question or growth edge and I've thrown it out to those two listservs, I've just been amazed at what people have gotten.
Excellent. No, thank you for that plug, and look forward to having you back on, Dr. Trujillo. I know this won't be the last time that we get to have a conversation with you. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So again, thank you, Dr. Trujillo, for your expertise and for having this conversation with us. Look forward to seeing everybody at our future webinars and our quarterly VA section member meeting. Hopefully everybody has a safe holiday season with your loved ones. Take care. We'll see you next time.